Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre is one of the most riveting love stories ever penned in English literature. First published in 1847 in 3 volumes under the pseudonym Currer Bell, the same year as Sister Anne's Agnes Grey and Sister Emily's Wuthering Heights. Jane Eyre would prove to be a smash hit in Charlotte Bronte's lifetime, and its popularity has endured until the present day, and it's not difficult to see why. This novel is a treat for readers who adore sublime descriptions and gothic motifs, and its themes, which include love, social class, gender roles, religion, independence, and the development and assertion of self-identity. All of this keeps the book as fresh today as when it was first published. Indeed, Bronte was exploring themes concerning the place of women in the world and male-female relationships in a way that would have made her very much ahead of her time. Jane Eyre is a timeless work and will continue to inform and move readers for centuries to come. We read Charlotte Bronte for prose that feels like a force of nature, and we read Jane Eyre for deep psychological insight and a deft exploration of the human condition. And today, as we are now kicking off a deep reading lecture series at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature, let's talk about how to approach this classic novel and run through some mindsets that will enable you to obtain a more robust appreciation of this masterpiece. And let's meet the writer of this classic. Now, we're going to keep this discussion as spoiler-free as possible, so if this is the first time you're reading Jane Eyre, you're coming to this work for the first time, then you are safe. I'm not going to go massively into plot details, and I'm going to stay away from anything that would spoil the novel for a first reader. We will be discussing the fine details and specific plot points in our lecture series at the book club, and my focus in today's video is going to be biographical, because making the acquaintance of Charlotte Brontë will facilitate a very deep appreciation of Jane Eyre and will help keep us away from spoilers. I very much personally wish to preserve some of the magic of that first reading experience if you're coming to Jane Eyre for the first time. And despite the classic status of this novel, that's very possible. It is possible that this will be a fresh read for many. And if you don't know what happens in Jane Eyre, then you do want to keep yourself protected, because having the story unfold before you for the first time is a very special experience. This is a very romantic, very thrilling and enthralling story. And if you're anything like me, you're going to absolutely love the central protagonist, you're going to love the heroine, Jane Eyre, and you may even see something of yourself in her. And if you do, that means you are in sympathy with the author, Charlotte Brontë. Now, if you went to a London bookstore in 1847, you may have been lucky enough to pick up a copy of an exciting new work that won early review, called one of the most powerful domestic romances to have appeared in years. The work, this review said, had nothing of the old conventional stamp upon it. It was a tale of passion that would make the pulses gallop, the heart beat, and fill the eye with tears. And indeed, if you turned those soon-to-be tear-filled eyes of yours to the title page, you would have seen this: Jane Eyre, an autobiography, edited by Currer Bell. How incredibly enigmatic. Who is Jane Eyre? Is this really an autobiography? Isn't this a novel? Isn't this a work of fiction? And indeed, who is this Currer Bell fellow? Was this a man writing, or is this a woman using a pen name? What do we know of the author? What do we know of the editor? Are they young? Are they old? who are they? Now, the subtitle of autobiography, of course, makes readers wonder about the degree to which they are reading fact or fiction, and indeed this is reinforced throughout the novel. In the opening of chapter 10, we're told that this is not to be a regular autobiography. Now, indeed, whenever we pick up a novel, we almost always wonder about the degree to which it is autobiographical. And great writers know that fiction is a lie that tells the truth. And you can be more truthful in an ostensibly made-up story than you can be, very often, in straight autobiography. Now, there's always a danger of reading too much into a work, and biographical readings can frequently take more license with reality than they really should. But in Jane Eyre, the parallels with Charlotte's own life are overt and significant. Now, for me personally, it's the more covert connections that inspire me when I'm thinking about the relationship between a work and its author. And I like to think of art as a product of sublimation. The writer channels their deepest desires, their fears, frustrations, wishes, hopes, ambitions, and their worldview into their work. And so novel becomes an extension of self. And then it is flung out into the world for readers to meet that other self. They meet that self halfway and they see something of themselves in the other. So why did Charlotte Brontë write Jane Eyre? There's always going to be a proliferation of reasons, conscious and unconscious, when it comes to artistic production. And nowhere is that more evident than when it comes to Jane Eyre, the product of Charlotte Brontë's artistic genius. Now, I'm going to be reductive and I'm going to pick one conscious reason for her writing this novel and one unconscious reason. Though indeed it could be argued very compellingly that the unconscious reason was actually incredibly conscious too. Let's start with the conscious reason. The Brontë family needed money. They lived up in Haworth in Yorkshire, and the Brontë siblings, Emily most significantly, but Charlotte too, would wander the moors, and you can see evocations of the moors. You can see the influence of the natural world burst through sublimely in their work. Understanding where the Brontes hailed from goes a long way towards understanding why they were so obsessed with the weather and so accomplished when it came to pathetic fallacy. The weather as symbolically representing the characters' moods. Compound an understanding of where they hailed from with an understanding of their influences, the fact that they were reading romantic writers like Shelley and Lord Byron, and you have a perfect storm, pun intended, for gaining a deeper appreciation of their work. Now, the thing about Haworth is it was a very sickly village. There was no proper sewage system, and there were open drains along Main Street and the back lanes, and the cesspools were a breeding ground for all sorts of disease. Privies were shared by up to a dozen families, and the water supply was limited and impure. The church graveyard was dangerously overfilled and also contributed an additional source of pollution to the water supply. Now, due to this poor hygiene level, the mortality rate in the village of Haworth was incredibly high. Nearly half of the children born in the village died before the age of 6, and the average age of death was only around 30 years old. Patrick Brontë, the father of the family, an Irish immigrant from what is now Northern Ireland, one of around 300,000 around this time, many of whom had turned up famished in England. Patrick Brontë was a priest of the local parish church, and he was going blind. Now, he was the only source of family income, so if he couldn't work, they were all in big trouble. So what we see is Charlotte starts rallying her sisters to publish their works together, beginning with their poetry, published under the pseudonyms of Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. That's Charlotte, Emily and Anne. Now, Charlotte was very excited about Emily's poetry. She was going through her things when she shouldn't have, and she was reading Emily's poems. These were very, very private poems, and if you've read the poetry of Emily Bronte, then you'll know that they are some of the best poems in the English language. They are sublime, they're masterpieces, and Charlotte could see that immediately. Emily, however, was very, very unhappy that Charlotte had been going through her things and reading her writings. She saw this as a gross invasion of her privacy, and the prospect of publishing these poems, well, that was unthinkable because they were incredibly personal, incredibly intimate, incredibly raw. There's no way she would have wanted to put them out in the world to be judged on. Now, Emily might have been furious, but luckily Anne came forward and somewhat diffused the situation by saying that she would like to get involved and maybe she could publish something with them both. And so, after a little bit of persuasion and a bit of upset, they adopted these pseudonyms, these pen names to disguise their identity. And they did indeed publish a volume of their poems together. Now, this was not a success and it only sold 2 volumes. Now, the Brontes had always written. They'd written during their childhood, and Charlotte and Emily, with brother Branwell and sister Anne, would create these secret dramas. They called them bedtime plays, and they would put little performances on. They created their own imaginary worlds, and their heroes and heroines were modelled on byronic protagonists and the political players discussed in Blackwood's magazine. Patrick had gifted Branwell some toy soldiers, and each of the siblings adopted one and would write things from the point of view of their adopted soldier, giving him a vivid backstory. These stories were written in minute handwriting and stitched together in miniature books, and many have seen the creation of these imaginary worlds as a response to their bleak reality, a reality that was filled with hunger and sickness and cold. All this to say, the Brontes were a curious breed. They had a vivid collective imagination that we are hard pushed to see matched by any other group of sibling writers in English or indeed in world literature. So they needed money for the family, and Charlotte saw herself as the family's saviour. After the failed poetry publication, we see the sisters move towards pushing their fiction into the hands of publishers. And Charlotte was a fierce advocate for Emily's Wuthering Heights and Anne's Agnes Grey. The plan was to have these two published alongside her own work, The Professor. The problem was that publishers didn't want The Professor. The proposal was to publish these together, and publishers found these to be a strange mix. Now, indeed, if you read the Brontes as a collective, which I think is a very good thing to do, rather than just reading Charlotte's work, rather than just reading Wuthering Heights or the writings of Anne, you should read the Brontes generally, and you can see that there are commonalities. You can tell that they're sisters and they're from the same family, and they did have an influence upon one another. Despite that, it was a bit of an odd mixture. Honestly, it would be quite odd publishing anything alongside Wuthering Heights. If you've read that novel, then you'll know exactly why. That's a standalone. I don't know what other work could be rightly published beside it. But the publishers thought they could publish Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights together, with Wuthering Heights taking up the first 2 volumes and Agnes Grey taking up the last volume. This obviously left Charlotte without a work in publication. So she went back to writing, and she persevered, and she started writing in secret, or largely in secret. Now, we know from Elizabeth Gaskell's The Life of Charlotte Brontë, which is a tremendous biography. Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Brontë were friends, so she could obtain a very intimate access to the details of her life. We know from this biography that Charlotte did share snippets of her work in progress with her sisters. Indeed, she talks about receiving feedback, some constructive criticism from Emily and Anne. And she also talks about sticking to her artistic guns. Doesn't matter what they say, I know what I'm producing is the way it's supposed to be. But she did largely keep this project, Jane Eyre, secret. She definitely kept it secret from her father, and he didn't know about Jane Eyre until after it was published, and that was quite a thing, because she was looking after him at this time. He was ill, and this would have been very demanding work. Now, indeed, it's interesting to think about what her composition process would have looked like. around this time she was suffering from her own diminishing eyesight, just like her father, and she was fearing that she might go blind too. And so she wrote Jane Eyre on these really small squares of paper, and she needed to hold the paper very close to her face. One thinks she must have snatched an hour or so here and there during the night, during a quiet moment, in order to compose this great work. Now, in addition to keeping the composition of Jane Eyre relatively secret, Charlotte would also endeavour to keep her identity secret, and she managed to do so for quite a while after publication. Jane Eyre was published in 1847, and she kept her name away from it until the end of 1850. Now, in the biographical note for new editions, Charlotte revealed Currer Bell to be a pen name. And she also revealed her sisters to be Ellis and Acton Bell. And by that point, both of them had tragically died. Emily died in December of 1848, and Anne would follow on shortly afterwards in May of 1849. Charlotte would live a little longer and then tragically die whilst pregnant. Again, we talk about the sisters together because it's very difficult to talk about a single Bronte in isolation. It's very rewarding to talk about them as a unity, as a whole, to talk about the Bronte sisters. And indeed, I like to reread at least one Bronte novel every year during the autumn months and into the winter. I find it's a very good time of year to do so. Now, once the secret was out that Charlotte Brontë was Currer Bell, speculation began to arise as to her relationship with Jane Eyre. Was Jane Eyre her? And indeed, William Thackeray, Charlotte's artistic hero, writer of Vanity Fair, and the one she dedicated this novel, Jane Eyre, to. Thackeray solicited Charlotte Bronte's anger, and indeed she had a furious temper. He solicited her anger at a lecture whilst they were congregating afterwards, when he introduced his mother to Charlotte, and he introduced her by saying, "Mother, you must allow me to introduce you to Jane Eyre." Now, she gave him a good chastising after that, and we can see this anger surface in her central protagonist in the novel. And personally, I absolutely love her defiance, her defiant attitude, especially very early on, when she says to her dear friend, Helen Burns, "You are good to those who are good to you. It is all I ever desire to be. If people were always kind and obedient to those who are cruel and unjust, the wicked people would have it all their own way. They would never feel afraid, and so they would never alter, but would grow worse and worse. When we are struck at without a reason, we should strike back again very hard. I am sure we should. So hard as to teach the person who struck us never to do it again." And her friend says, "You will change your mind, I hope, when you grow older. As yet you are but a little untaught girl." To which Jane replies, "But I feel this, Helen. I must dislike those who, whatever I do to please them, persist in disliking me. I must resist those who punish me unjustly. It is as natural as that I should love those who show me affection, or submit to punishment when I feel it is deserved." I love it. I love the defiance. I love that anger coming through. Now, we might wonder, why was Charlotte so keen to keep her identity, her authorship, a secret? Yes, it's true that women would adopt male pen names in the 19th century for fear of their fiction not being taken seriously. But I personally take this as a sign of how much she put of herself into the work. She put so much of her inmost self into Jane Eyre, her dreams, her fears, her desires, her worldview. When you read Jane Eyre, you are reading Charlotte Brontë at her most intimate, vulnerable and raw, but also at her most powerful, beautiful and truthful too. Now, another explanation as to the secrecy of Charlotte's authorship of Jane Eyre comes in the form of her romantic life, or her romantic longings. And I see this as being the more covert inspiration for the work. This is the sublimation. It's important to know that when Patrick had started to go blind, before rallying her sisters to publish their works, Charlotte Brontë had tried to secure financial stability for the family by her and Emily aiming to start their own school. And so in 1842 they travelled to Brussels and enrolled at a school and started learning French. The idea was that this would help them attract students themselves in the future. Charlotte Brontë, 26 years old, fell in love with her schoolmaster, and emphasis on the word master, which she deployed significantly and recurrently in her letters and in her works. The schoolmaster's name was Constantin Heger, and he was the husband of the woman running the school. That's right, Charlotte Brontë fell in love with a married man. She would describe Heger as a man of power as to mind, but very choleric and irritable in temperament. A little black ugly being with a face that varies in expression. Sometimes he borrows the lineaments of an insane tomcat, sometimes those of a delirious hyena. Occasionally, but very seldom, he discards these perilous attractions and assumes an air not above 100 degrees removed from what you would call mild and gentlemanlike. Charlotte returns home in 1844 and we see that Charlotte writes a lot of letters to Heger. Now, many of them don't survive, but the ones that do are compiled in this Oxford World's Classics edition of Charlotte Bronte's letters, which is very much worth perusing if you want to get a more intimate understanding of the author and therefore see the writer in the work. Charlotte starts to write these really passionate letters to this schoolmaster, and she's met with just cold, restrained replies. Indeed, he'd only really reply 6 months apart, spaced apart. He wasn't writing a lot. And we read her letters and they are tortured. We can see that this is a young woman who is suffering from unrequited love, significantly unrequited love. He did not return her affections, and this tormented her. She spoke of the period of waiting for his next letter as being like torment. She'd wait and wait and wait, and then love these really restrained, cold responses. We see in her letters that she's concerned about not being egotistical. That's what she writes in one of the letters. I'll stop being egotistical, or I'll try to. We see that she is suffering from poor eyesight and she's not very well, and she's telling him all her woes. She talks about how she would love to write a book and she would love to dedicate it to him. In one particularly painful letter, she writes, "Day and night I find neither rest nor peace. If I sleep, I have tormenting dreams in which I see you, always severe, always saturnine and angry with me. I cannot," she says, "and I will not resign myself to the total loss of my master's friendship. I would rather undergo the greatest bodily pains than have my heart constantly lacerated by searing regrets. If my master withdraws his friendship from me entirely, I shall be absolutely without hope. If he gives me a little friendship, a very little, I shall be content, happy. I would have a motive for living, for working." And she says, "You showed me a little interest when I was a pupil in Brussels, and now I cling to the preservation of this little interest. I cling to it as I would cling on to life. Perhaps you'll say to me, I no longer take the slightest interest in you, Miss Charlotte. You no longer belong to my household. I have forgotten you. Well, monsieur, tell me so candidly. It will be a shock to me. That doesn't matter. It will still be less horrible than uncertainty. I don't want to reread this letter. I'm sending it as I've written. Nevertheless, I am dimly aware that there are some cold and rational people who would read it and say, she is raving. My sole revenge is to wish these people a single day of the torments I have suffered for 8 months. Then we would see whether they wouldn't be raving too. one suffers in silence so long as one has the strength, and when that strength fails, one speaks without measuring one's words too much. Very, very painful stuff. What we have in Charlotte Bronte's letters to Heger is perhaps some of the most unrelenting series of descriptions of unrequited love in the history of letters. So he would take forever to respond, and when he did, he was cold and restrained, and then one day he just stopped replying completely. He wasn't talking to her anymore. So distant responses followed by silence. And indeed, if you want to learn more about Charlotte's life around this time, because it is fascinating and I think it helps us sympathise with her more, it breaks Jane Eyre wide open for us, it makes it a completely different reading experience, then we are spoiled for choice when it comes to biographies. And I would recommend picking up a few. There's Elizabeth Gaskell's, which I've already mentioned. You can pick up her letters. They're fascinating documents. There is Claire Harmon's biography, which is brilliant. And then there's a really fantastic book called The Secret History of Jane Eyre, which I highly, highly recommend. Very good stuff. So Charlotte's in love with this man. He goes cold on her and stops responding. The love was unrequited anyway. And then we see a couple of years on, Charlotte summons her experience with Heger in Brussels to write The Professor, and then she pens Jane Eyre, an autobiography. So what is Charlotte Brontë doing? Well, she's sublimating that unrequited love into her writing, and in this novel she had an opportunity to fulfill her romantic longing. She's fantasizing essentially, and she could voice her frustrations, she could voice her desires, she could give voice to her inmost feelings, and she could talk to Heger. She can't talk to him anymore, he's not responding, so she's not writing any more letters, but she wants to go on talking to him. So she talks to Heger as Jane, and he talks back, and this is wish fulfillment, he talks back in the form of Rochester in the novel. And indeed, even if you know nothing about Jane Eyre, you will probably recognise the name Rochester. You'll probably have an image of Rochester as byronic hero, somewhat like Heathcliff, though it must be said that Rochester is much more tame in comparison to Heathcliff. And indeed, if you've read both books, Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, I would love to know which protagonist, which male lead you prefer and why. Heathcliff or Rochester. Compare them and consider which one you like more. I personally find it very interesting that we have one male romantic lead who was inspired by a very real person in Charlotte's life. And critics would say that Rochester was compounded and influenced by her brother, her father, and Lord Byron and a few other influences, whilst Emily, her male romantic lead, didn't spring from a specific love interest in her real life. And so we wonder, where on earth did Heathcliff spring from? He sprang right from the core of Emily's being. But that's a discussion for another day, and indeed if you're interested in reading Wuthering Heights and you would like a series of lectures to take you through the book, then we have a Wuthering Heights lecture series available in the back catalogue at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. But anyway, it's really interesting to note that obviously as readers we are living vicariously, yeah? And I talk about living the great books, and part of that means flexing our imaginative powers, seeing everything, putting yourself in the shoes of the characters, meeting the characters, taking their concerns on as your own, and then bringing your lived experience, your life to bear on the work, and thinking about the book whilst you go out and about and live your life. But we can see that with Charlotte Brontë, her artistic output, her novel, was vicarious experience too. She gets to talk to Heger through Jane to Rochester. "All my heart is yours, sir," Jane says. "It belongs to you, and with you it would remain, were fate to exile the rest of me from your presence forever." And the fact that Charlotte put so much of herself into the fiction was something that caused her anxiety when it came to the publication of the novel. But she also had an anxiety about the degree to which the novel was more imaginative flexing rather than drawing from actual personal experience. She did draw from personal experience, but it's certainly true that she brought a lot of her imaginative prowess to the novel in order to bolster it. Now, she was writing letters to George Lewes around around this time. You might recognise the name. George Lewes was the partner of Mary Ann Evans, George Eliot. And he warned Charlotte against her excessive indulging in flights of fancy, and he implored her to stick to experience. She, of course, was concerned that she had limited experience but a rich inner life, and she had read extensively, so that helped too, but thank goodness she overcame this anxiety and ultimately rejected Lewes's advice to stay away from imagination, for fear that the work would not be truthful, because what we have is brilliant. It's a literary masterpiece. Pushing back against the advice to restrain her imagination, Charlotte writes, "Imagination is a strong, restless faculty which claims to be heard and exercised. Are we to be quite deaf to her cry and insensate to her struggles? When she shows us bright pictures, are we never to look at them and try to reproduce them? And when she is eloquent and speaks rapidly and urgently in our ear, are we not to write to her dictation?" Jane Eyre is the product of a very fertile imagination, and it's stitched together from the tradition of literature. There is a really strong love of storytelling, the act and process of storytelling itself running through this book. And that love of storytelling ties into the supernatural elements in Jane Eyre. We have fairy tales and folklore and gothic elements in the DNA of Jane Eyre. Now, the Gothic in the early 19th century wouldn't have been considered literary exactly, or high literature. It was a popular form of entertainment, which is interesting because we study the Gothic form today. That was one of my personal areas of interest at university. The Gothic surged in popularity and exploded out of the French Revolution. It was pretty much a knock-on effect of the French Revolution, which was before Charlotte Bronte's time, just a little bit before. But she would have been growing up in a culture in England that was seeing a lot of insurrection, a lot of turmoil across the Channel in France. What we see is towards the end of the 18th century, we have the horrors of the French Revolution, we have people being guillotined in the street, we have the king being executed, we have the mob turning on itself, we have complete chaos, and then we see a surge in popularity of the Gothic, and it was almost like the horrors of the Reign of Terror were funneled into this dark, unconscious, nightmare reflection of reality. Now, Anne Radcliffe, one of the most exemplary writers of the Gothic form, often considered to be the mother of the Gothic novel, and keep in mind at this time the idea of a novel itself and the Gothic was intertwined. If you said novel, people generally thought Gothic and all of the tropes that we take to be Gothic now. Anne Radcliffe delineated the difference between terror and horror, because these Gothic novels were referred to as terror novels. The difference is this: terror is the feeling leading up to the dread, the awful thing that you're about to experience, whereas horror is the feeling of revulsion, the recoil, the response to that dread, that awful thing. Stephen King in Danse Macabre would put it like this: terror on top, horror down below, and the cheapest of all would be the gross out. Gore, essentially. Even though the Gothic wouldn't have been considered exactly literary, terror was the higher form, or the grander feeling that writers wanted to summon in their readers. Gothic tropes include supernatural encounters, sublime landscapes, ruins, antiquated spaces, and dark secrets. And that's key. The sins of the past return to haunt the protagonists in the present. And a lot of Gothic novels would put women at the centre of the narrative. Now, I'm going to link in the body of the lecture post at the Hardcore Literature Book Club our deep dive video and introduction to the Gothic, because we go very in-depth in that video, and we will of course explore the Gothic as we read through Jane Eyre together. But there's a very strong Gothic tone to Jane Eyre, and one doesn't want to give too much away by supplying details, but as we've said, there's also a number of fairy tales and folk tales running through the fabric of the novel too. Stories like Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, and Bluebeard, among many others. So we have this Gothic tone, and we have a byronic hero, a byronic male lead in the form of Rochester. When we think of byronic heroes, we think about the romantic poets, particularly the poet who lent his name to the archetype, the description, Lord Byron himself. The Brontes, like most of England and most of Europe actually, were obsessed with the tales of Lord Byron, his exploits, not just his poetry, but his lifestyle too. Lord Byron, of course, also lent his image to the vampire. How we understand the vampire today, from Polidori on to Bram Stoker, is heavily influenced by Lord Byron. So we think about the romantic poets when we think about byronic protagonists, but we also think about Milton's Satan. Milton's Satan was the pre-byronic anti-hero. And indeed, at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we are engaging in a slow and very rewarding appreciation of Paradise Lost. And that is a brilliant work to run alongside Jane Eyre. You will find these two to be very complementary reads. So we have a byronic male lead, we have a gothic tone and atmosphere and sublime descriptions, we have extraordinary imagery and tropes from fairy tales gifted to us by a very imaginative writer, but all of this is given to us in plain language, plain dealing language, and that is something that we should pay attention to as well. We see another significant influence in the writing of Charlotte Brontë in the form of Wordsworth and Coleridge. Specifically, I'm thinking about their preface to lyrical ballads. Now, there are three huge seismic shifts when it comes to the history of English literature in the form of three writers: Shakespeare, Milton, and Wordsworth. Now, the really interesting thing about Wordsworth comes in the form of that preface to lyrical ballads. They set out their aims that would change the course of English poetry. This is an aesthetic manifesto, and one of the aims or the guidelines was that they would employ everyday language that was best suited for poetry, just common everyday language. And that's what we get in Jane Eyre. It's poetic prose, yes, it's sumptuous, it's evocative, it's romantic, you can see everything. But the style is everyday language. It's not highfalutin, it's not language that poses a barrier to entry. One doesn't need a dictionary by their side in order to gain an appreciation of Jane Eyre. And this surprises many readers who come to the work for the first time. Many readers who don't read a lot of classic literature and are expecting a challenge are surprised that it's incredibly readable. So when you read through Jane Eyre, notice that we have intimations of the otherworldly, the supernatural. Notice how they run alongside the mundane. And indeed, our heroine, Jane Eyre, is described in both supernatural and mundane terms. Rochester calls her a changeling, she's referred to as an elf, as a sprite, and she has a very fertile imagination. She gets these premonitions and is very sensitive to omens. When we read Jane Eyre, we feel as though we are really reading a story, a prototypical story with all the fancy and imagination. But the curious thing is we do also have reality running alongside the supernatural elements, the fanciful elements, the elements that are torn out of fairy tales. Despite serving up a really imaginative concoction, Charlotte herself was very keen to make her heroine, in her words, a plain one, a plain woman like herself. And indeed, one of the themes we have explored in this work is the idea of appearances being deceiving. And in the story, we do get Charlotte's insecurity, a note of her insecurity about her appearance, intrude into the work. And indeed, Rochester is supposed to be rather plain or unattractive as well, though that's very hard to envision as you read the story. Charlotte would say in a letter, "I sometimes regretted that I was not handsomer. I sometimes wished to have rosy cheeks, a straight nose, and small cherry mouth. I desired to be tall, stately, and finely developed in figure. I felt it a misfortune that I was so little, so pale, and had features so irregular and so marked." It seems our talk of the Gothic has had an impact on the weather, so I'm going to put a light on. Now, we hear some of Charlotte's own painful insecurity surface in the work when Jane tells herself that she is too plain for Rochester. She calls herself a blind puppy. She must be blind to think that she's a favourite of Rochester's. It does good to no woman, she says to herself, to be flattered by her superior, who cannot possibly intend to marry her. And it is madness in all women to let a secret love kindle within them, which, if unreturned and unknown, must devour the life that feeds it, and if discovered and responded to, must lead, ignis fatuus-like, into miry wilds whence there is no extrication. Listen then, Jane Eyre, to your sentence. Tomorrow, place the glass before you, and draw in chalk your own picture, faithfully, without softening one defect. Omit no harsh line, smooth away no displeasing irregularity. Write under it, portrait of a governess, disconnected, poor and plain. Afterwards, take a piece of smooth ivory. Take your palette, mix your freshest, finest, clearest tints, choose your most delicate camel hair pencils, delineate carefully the loveliest face you can imagine. And then, whenever in future you should chance to fancy Mr. Rochester thinks well of you, take out these two pictures and compare them. Say, Mr. Rochester might probably win that noble lady's love if he chose to strive for it. Is it likely he would waste a serious thought on this indigent and insignificant plebeian? Very, very harsh words. I think every reader is going to be able to relate to this to some degree and sympathise with it, because we are all our own worst critics. Compared to how we talk to ourselves, there's not much that another can say to us that's worse. Our self-talk, sometimes when we're in a bad mood or we're suffering from insecurities and doubts, our self-talk is awful. If we spoke to another the way we spoke to ourselves in our darkest moments, then people wouldn't like us. They wouldn't like to get to know us or be friends with us. So it's painfully relatable, this really critical, sharp self-talk. And so Charlotte wanted to make her heroine plain, and by that she means normal, by that she means like her. And up until this point, heroines in literature would have been physically beautiful and they would have had something striking about them. But Charlotte was keen to elevate real rather than idealised women. This, of course, doesn't stop Rochester from falling in love with her, but where Jane is idealised, aspirational, extraordinary for the time period, is in the content of her speech, her character, her beliefs, her words. And allow me to read one of my personal favourite passages in the entire book. Let's appreciate this together, because this is very powerful stuff. This is very early on in the book, in chapter 12, when Jane talks about her sole relief being to allow my mind's eye to dwell on whatever bright visions rose before it, and certainly they were many and glowing, to let my heart be heaved by the exultant movement which, while it swelled it in trouble, expanded it with life, and best of all, to open my inward ear to a tale that was never ended, a tale my imagination created, and narrated continuously, quickened with all of incident, life, fire, feeling that I desired and had not in my actual existence. And then we get to something really extraordinary. It is vain to say that human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. Millions are condemned to a stiller doom than mine, and millions are in silent revolt against their lot. Nobody knows how many rebellions, besides political rebellions, ferment in the masses of life which people earth. Women are supposed to be very calm, generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. And it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. Bear in mind that around this time there was a lot of social unrest and unease. As I said, the British public would look across the Channel and they would be concerned that the revolts, insurrections and uprisings in France would start happening here. They were worried about the precedent set by the French Revolution at the end of the previous century, and the early part of the 19th century had been dominated by the Napoleonic Wars. So when Charlotte summons the language of revolt, and she does so in various places in the novel, she sounds very dangerous. What we get here, and in this novel generally, is a powerful cry for liberty and equality. Jane is an advocate for her sex, and whilst readers might point out that there is no overt cry for legal equality, how can we read this novel as anything other than a cry for equality? With passages such as this: "Do you think I am an automaton, a machine without feelings? Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart. I am not talking to you now through the medium of custom, conventionalities, nor even of mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, just as if both had passed through the grave and we stood at God's feet, equal as we are." Yes, we get a cry for equality between the sexes, but one that can be read universally too. At time of recording at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we are reading Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And readers who are overlapping these two novels, Jane Eyre and Invisible Man, might see some interesting thematic parallels emerge. You might find that these works that typically aren't read together will inform each other in very exciting ways. Ellison's book is about race and identity. Identity as a black man in the early 20th century, but Ellison stressed the fact that in his novel, blackness was an allegory for the human condition. And as a man reading Jane Eyre, I really connect to that tone of defiance. I really connect to the quest for self-identity and independence, and the quest to be loved on equal terms for who you truly are. And this is a book that is ultimately about self-mastery, as much as it is about the power dynamics between the self and others. As we've said, Charlotte would call the man who inspired Rochester her master, and indeed that would be the correct term to use as governess. She was a governess, just like Jane, and indeed when it comes to the view of governesses at the time, we'll have a lot to talk about in our lecture series, because governesses were seen as being liable to madness and licentious behaviour. They were seen as being very open to seduction, and there are a lot of class anxieties that come through when we think about the nature of a governess and her work. Jane, like Charlotte, is a governess who was also a clergyman's daughter, and that means that she is essentially in a rather ambiguous position when it comes to social class, which has a very profound effect on her perceived value in the marriage market. And what Bronte really wants to explore in this novel is the idea that marrying someone with whom you have a sympathy, and we might want to look to the etymology of the word sympathy, it means to suffer, in the same way that passion, the word passion, another word that we'll think about over the course of our reading of Jane Eyre, passion, we think of the passion of Christ, that's connected to suffering. If you're in simpatico with another, if you sympathise with another, then their suffering becomes your suffering. Bronte wants to explore the idea that it's better to marry someone you're in simpatico with, regardless of social class divisions, than doom yourself by marrying into a loveless marriage. But whatever you do, you must stay true to who you are. Charlotte Brontë, by the way, whilst we're thinking about marriage, received 3 marriage proposals during her lifetime. We know that her love for Heger was unrequited. She didn't want to marry for status or money. She really wanted to marry a man who could be her equal, her intellectual and emotional and spiritual equal. And yet, marrying for love was absolutely not the norm. That was the exception, not the rule. You'd be very lucky if you could marry for love during the 19th century. Charlotte would receive 3 marriage proposals during her life, and she would ultimately marry her father's curate, and then she would tragically die during pregnancy a few months later. This book, of course, explores social divisions and power dynamics, but it also ultimately is about self-mastery. And Jane's orphan status, which was a very popular motif at this time, although we've always loved stories about orphans. But Jane Eyre's orphan status allows for an exploration of the human condition at the extremes, at its most extreme. It is a very strange sensation, she says, and we get a Jane who's deploying a memoir tone of voice. This is a backward-looking, reflexive narrative, so we get multiple identities. We get a younger Jane, we get an older Jane, we get this curious relationship between self now, self who has become the self, and self who I used to be, the I who is no longer. It is a very strange sensation, she says, to inexperienced youth to feel itself quite alone in the world, cut adrift from every connection, uncertain whether the port to which it is bound can be reached. And so we get this exploration of the human condition at the extreme, but we all can connect to that feeling of dislocation, being disconnected and completely alone in the world, and needing somebody to sympathise with, who sympathises with us. We can all relate to that, I think. And Charlotte, through Jane, wants, I believe, the reader to think about their own position. She wants us to live vicariously and experience this story as though it were happening to us. And in so doing, perhaps we come closer to achieving our own self-mastery. And I absolutely love the intimate connection between author or author construct, central protagonist and reader, us. I love the intimate friendship we have. Throughout the story, Jane Eyre talks to us directly. She says reader, and the direct reader address also gifts us the most famous line in the novel. But I'm going to refrain from quoting that line. If you've read the story already, then you're going to think of it immediately. Now, this was a convention at the time, saying, hey, reader, and commenting upon what's happening in the narrative itself. You'll see this in Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, you'll see this in Thackeray's Vanity Fair and Barry Lyndon. But I find it really interesting to contemplate here, because when Charlotte Brontë deploys this convention, I personally find it far less intrusive and disruptive. With some books that utilise this convention, it breaks the flow of the narrative and it yanks you out of the world. But I find that the experience of reading Jane Eyre is an immersive one all the way through. It's brilliant. Powerful escapism. Now, when it comes to the central protagonist, the heroine, I have read criticism and I've heard from readers who aren't wholly sympathetic to Jane Eyre, or they don't find her sympathetic, they don't particularly like her. Now, that's not something that I completely understand, personally. Yes, in her younger days, she's wild, she's rebellious, and part of the novel, part of her journey towards self-mastery, which is tied to her being an advocate for her sex, involves controlling that. But these are the reasons why I love her as a character. We get a very intimate view of her innermost workings, and Jane Eyre to me feels like a very real, living, breathing, thinking human being. Perhaps this is why Charlotte so fiercely resisted the works of Jane Austen when she finally came to them. She came to Austen very late in her life, thanks to George Lewes. He recommended she check out Austen's work, and she did not like her stories. Now, I think that was potentially an unconscious element of disliking the fact that Austen had represented psychologically complex human beings before her. Her personages came before her. That's not what Charlotte Brontë herself says, of course. She professes that she disliked those novels for a different reason, but I think that's the source of that conflict. And indeed, all art is conflict. It's agon, it's competition, it's wrestling with one's precursors. And I think her resistance to Jane Austen is a tip-off to the fact that her characters are very, very strong. Strong writers resist strong writers. But all this to say, I absolutely love the element of the author in the work, in the central character. If you have a rebellious streak in you, you know right from the start of the novel that you're going to love this story. Indeed, there's fire right from the start, with Currer Bell's preface, where after she thanks everybody who supported the novel, she then has some scathing remarks to the novel's detractors. She's throwing a punch at those who tore her down, and she says conventionality is not morality, because indeed around this time many of the harsh criticisms would say that Jane Eyre was an immoral book. Conventionality is not morality, she says. Self-righteousness is not religion. Appearance should not be mistaken for truth. It's important to know that there was indeed widespread censoring of Jane Eyre upon publication, and the moral objections were largely due to how critically the author presented fervently religious characters. But it wasn't just that, it was also the pro-woman tone and message that comes through. Charlotte Brontë is advocating for independence of mind for women. She's also a fierce advocate for love, as we've said, that transcends social boundaries. All of this meant that the book was not appreciated by more conventional readers of the time. This was an affront to the time. This was a rebellious book. And indeed, Charlotte Brontë really is a bit of a rebel. Jane Eyre was a revolutionary text that was seen as dangerous. And indeed, one review from 1848 had this to say: "The tone of mind and thought which has overthrown authority and violated every code, human and divine, is the same which has also written Jane Eyre." Well, if you ask me, that should be right there on the blurb. Print that on the back cover and I'll be picking that book up. Now, that seems like a good place to wrap things up, but before we do, let's talk practicalities. The logistics of actually reading Jane Eyre. First things first, recommended edition. I personally recommend the Penguin paperback edition, though I love the Oxford World's Classics edition too, but feel free to use any edition that comes most freely to hand. I will be referring to this edition over the course of the Hardcore Literature Book Club lecture series, but it will be easy enough to orient yourself and work through with whatever edition you can get your hands on. For those who love audiobooks, there is a tremendous audiobook version of Jane Eyre recommended to me by many book club readers, and I can see why. The narrator is the tremendous Juliet Stevenson. She's very, very good. If you see that a work is narrated by Juliet Stevenson, then you can be assured that it's going to be very well read. Now let's talk a little bit about pacing. Yeah, the structure of this novel is very tight. It's very tightly constructed, it's very well plotted, and the theme informs the structure. There is a structural unity due to Jane's evolution, her growth, her character development, all of that informs the structure. This story is a Bildungsroman. This book is split into 3 volumes. It was published in 3 volumes, but we can see 5 phases of character development in our central protagonist and 5 different locales, and each locale, each location is marked by a different tone. Now the 5 stages of character growth kind of puts us in mind of a 5-act drama, but in novel form, and of course Charlotte would absolutely love this parallel. Indeed, very early on in the opening of chapter 11, Jane says, "A new chapter in a novel is something like a new scene in a play, and when I draw up the curtain this time, reader, you must fancy you see a room," and she goes on to describe it, and she says all of this is visible to you. So it's like we're reading a play in novel form. And at the end of each phase, Jane then moves on to the next stage of her life. Despite the stages of development, there is a lot of parallelism, there's repetition, there's foreshadowing, there are echoes and recalls of earlier information. So the unity of the work, along with a feeling of organic development, makes for a very satisfying reading experience, despite the 5 stages of development, which we will chart along the way during our read-through at the book club. I find the tripartite nature of the novel as published, the 3 volumes, to make for good milestones. Little refreshment breaks, if you like, where readers can discuss everything that's happened up until that point and hypothesize about what they're going to see next. The first volume of Jane Eyre runs from chapter 1 to chapter 15. That's around 177 pages in the Penguin. Volume 2 then runs up to chapter 26, which is page 342, and then the third volume is the rest of the novel. For our lectures at the book club, as always, I encourage self-pacing, and the book club is set up to facilitate self-pacing because there's no right or wrong way to read a book. There's no right or wrong speed. Everybody reads at different paces. But I think a really good pace to aim for, and a pace that will also accommodate other reading a few different things side by side, maybe another novel on the go like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man maybe, or a long epic poem like Milton's Paradise Lost, or a couple of Shakespeare plays. These are all complementary reads that we're talking about at the book club alongside Jane Eyre. I think a good pace would be around 15 pages a day. Anywhere between 10 to 20 pages would be brilliant. And we're going to have our discussions, our lectures spaced out roughly 10 days apart. So this book will be taking us through autumn if you're following along live. And that might sound like a bit of a breezy pace to many readers, but Jane Eyre is compulsively readable. Once you get into it, you most likely will find yourself immersed and hooked and dragged all the way through it. You'll get swept up in this story. I personally find that the pages fly by, and when I'm not reading it, I am thinking about all the different themes and preoccupations, so I'm reading it even when the book is not in front of me. I'm in discussion with Charlotte Brontë, and Charlotte Brontë starts to put herself in discussion with all of my other favourite writers. Now, the best way to really get the most out of a great work is to read it with other people, to share your insights with like-minded lovers of literature. And we're very fortunate to have an incredible group of lovers of literature from all over the world, all backgrounds, all ages, all occupations, but all united by that common love of great literature. We're fortunate to have this group at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. So if you want to give Jane Eyre a really deep, loving reading, then please join our book club read along. As usual, along with the discussions, the lectures, we'll have questions to prompt different insights. We'll have resources and recommendations for things to follow up if you want to go even deeper into the work. And as usual, it's going to be a life-changing experience. I'd like to end by saying thank you so much for watching. Thank you for reading along. Thank you for discussing great literature with me. If this is your first time reading Jane Eyre, if you're coming to Charlotte Bronte's great work for the first time, then let me ask you, what are you expecting? What are you hoping to get out of your reading? What themes from your wider reading are you hoping to pull in to Jane Eyre? And indeed, if this is a reread for you, then please let us know your history with the book, your relationship with Charlotte Brontë and the Brontë sisters generally. When was the last time you read the book? What did you make of it? And what are you hoping to get out of it this time around? And once again, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you, and I hope you have a lovely day. Happy reading, everybody, and bye-bye for now.